Hey everyone, welcome to the OptiSpan podcast. On today's episode, we're going to tackle a topic that is a bit more challenging, I would say, than a lot of the conversations we have. We're going to talk about grief and the impact that grief can have on health span, potentially biological aging, and hopefully some practical strategies for how people can deal with grief to kind of minimize potentially the negative impacts on health and maybe take some positives out of it. And this really stems from recent experiences that Nick and I have both had, that were pretty significant losses in both of our lives. So personally, many of you, I'm sure, know that I have had a German Shepherd named Dobby, who was a very important part of our family, an older dog, and we recently had to let him go, which was a extremely painful, difficult decision. It was after a period of pretty gradual decline. He had degenerative myelopathy, which is a condition where gradually get increased paralysis in the hind legs. And it got to a point where his quality of life, we felt had declined quite substantially. So regardless, we lost Dobby about a month ago. So it was October 11th, and I don't know, we're November, what is it, 8th today?
Yeah.
So it's been about a month. It was difficult for sure, and I would just say much more. I mean, I knew it would be hard, but it was much harder than I anticipated that it would be. So I've been dealing with a lot of going through the grief process myself, and that led me to think some about how, it was impacting my own mental health, my physical health, certainly. So I thought it was a good time to maybe do a little bit of research on what's known and then talk about it on the podcast. And I know you also recently had a loss that I'll let you share sort of your experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. We both kind of came to the idea of doing this episode at the same time, kind of separately. So September 25th, I lost my dad. So his name was Rick Arapis. He was only 60 years old. He struggled with alcoholism most of his life. I would say his 30s, 40s, 50s, he was a functional alcoholic. Around 2020, around COVID, as he started to age, which I think was a big part of it, he became not so functional, wasn't able to keep a job. A year ago, September a year ago, there was a house fire. My mom was actually out with her parents that day, so she wasn't there in the house. He tried to put it out. He got smoke inhalation and was essentially hospitalized for, I believe, 6 weeks. Lost a lot of muscle, high frailty, 59 years old at the time. He actually relapsed from alcohol, not relapsed, but withdrew from alcohol while he was in a coma there, an induced coma. So it kind of was a turning point where I was hoping he would stay off of it. He kind of, was fortunate enough to go through that withdrawal while he was unconscious, because I've heard it's a horrible situation. But he started drinking more. Without going into too much of the details, he essentially died from liver failure, and he fell while he had the liver failure, hit his head, had a brain bleed. And one thing I learned is that the liver plays a role in coagulation, and so the bleed wasn't stopping.
Right.
And so I got the call September 21st, the day before my son's birthday, went to see him, and then we were all there surrounded by family, took off the machines on Wednesday, September 25th, and that's when he passed. And it's really the first loss. I still have all my grandparents. Other than 2 German Shepherds, which were my childhood dogs growing up, this is the first real loss. And all of the stoicism and practicing and reading about death, just kind of, it was interesting to actually really feel it. I want to talk about that with you today.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, obviously there's a lot to unpack around every individual experience and then the topic itself. I think a couple of big picture things that I have thought about that resonated, with me going through this is one, I think often, even if you know something's coming, can't predict how the grief is going to affect you until it actually happens. And that everybody's going to experience grief differently. Everybody's going to react differently. I think it's super important to avoid judgment of yourself or other people based on how they react to, whatever whatever happened that is causing the grief, because I think it's a very individual thing. And, like in my case, I lost my father, several years ago now. And, some people, what I'm going to say, will look at it and they're going to think it's a terrible thing to say, but it's just my reality. Like, losing my father was much easier than losing Dobby
Mm-hmm.
from
Yeah.
the way I felt it personally, right? And there's lots of reasons for that. I wasn't that close to my dad. My parents were divorced when I was young. But this is all just to illustrate that I think, grief at its core, I believe, is loss, right? It is fear to some extent based on the loss, but it's because you've lost something. And the depth and extent of the emotional response to that loss is going to be very personal based on, you know, your own I want to say the importance of whatever you lost. I mean, its importance is part of it, but it's also, how much of your life was wrapped up in that individual, right? And so, like with Dobby, because of, I think, I mean, he was a very special dog his entire life. He was a part of our family. But I think in part because of the way he declined, for the last couple of months, somebody had to be with him all the time. We had to, we had a sling. We had to help him move, right? Because his back legs didn't work. So almost every waking moment for my wife and myself was in some way spent thinking about him when we were there. One of us had to be there. We couldn't go anywhere together for the last couple of years. It was really difficult. So not only did we love him and was he part of our family, but on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis, we were thinking about him. And so when he was gone, that was gone. That was missing, right? And so I think for me, that was part of why it was so much deeper maybe than I anticipated that it would be, because this thing that your life had been wrapped up in was just missing all of a sudden, and it was a thing that you loved. Mm-hmm. All of that is just to say that I don't think, I think it's really important when we're going through grief or when somebody we know, care about, love is experiencing grief, that we just don't apply judgment to it. Support the person as they go through the process. Just try really hard not to judge their response.
It's something you told me I wanted to talk about, which is how quiet your house is now.
Yeah.
People might not know, but you're also an empty nester for the first time
right.
in, 20-something years?
Right.
And so you went from having 6 living beings in your house to 2 or something along those lines. So I could
5,
see I could see how that might impact you.
Yeah, I mean, there's the aspect of grief that is loss of something. Then there's the change, right? Your life is different, and I think, and I'm not an expert in the topic, so I don't want to pretend to be. I'm like like many people, learning as I grow. But I think part of it is the change and the recognition, the feeling that things will never be the same. Right. And that also is part of the grief process that you've got to get through and accept. Yeah, things will never be the same. In some ways, they'll never be as good, but in other ways, maybe they'll be better. Right. And I think this is part of, as you know, here at OptiSpan, we've also, as a team, done a couple of workshops on fear and love and approaching life through the lens of love and not through fear. I think this is all tied up in grief, because a big part of grief is fear that your life will never be as good as it was, or you will never get back what you lost, right? And so I think trying to reframe that to accepting the loss and also recognizing that there's still a lot of good and things can get better and things will get better is a big part, at least for me personally, of going through this process. And in my personal situation, I think there are already, as my wife and I are starting to come out of this grief, we're already seeing some positives in the sense that, I think we've grown closer. We've talked a lot about our feelings as we've gone through the process. We're able to spend time together outside of the house that isn't revolving around taking care of Dobby or taking care of the kids. So I think there are reasons to be optimistic that there will be a lot of positives to come out of it. Doesn't change the loss, doesn't change the sadness, but also recognizes it's an and proposition. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's okay to feel grief. Yes, it's okay to feel sadness, and things will get better, and there are positives that will come out of it.
Yep. I think one takeaway too is looking back again. It's only been a month and a half, but I probably didn't handle it the best way. Again, my first time, I handled it a bit of a. You said I could take as much time as off from work that I needed. So this isn't anything to do with neuropathy span, but I only took I think 2.5 days off.
And I
3
encourage
days.
you to.
And that's me. Again, my
Yeah.
dad, he's very blue collar. So part of me was like, he never took time off. He worked.
Right.
And but then when I was here, I was useless. I'm kind of staring at my computer, and I'm just So that was one lesson I learned is I should probably have given myself more time.
Again, I think it's good to recognize that from a rational perspective, and you should give yourself some grace, right?
Mm-hmm.
And recognize, again, there is no right or wrong. Don't judge other people. I think this is the other flip side of that is don't judge yourself.
Yeah.
Give yourself grace. I think you're gonna. Again, I'm pretty fortunate. Well, maybe fortunate isn't the right word. I haven't been through a lot of severe grief experiences either. I mean, I've lost my grandparents. I lost my father. My mother's still alive, and I haven't really lost. I've lost other animals. Again, this is a little bit of a tangent, but anybody who's had a lot of companion animals, you love them all, but some of them you love more, which is different than my human kids. And so I've lost animals before. It was hard, but not like this. So I think you have to give yourself grace. I also think, from my own personal experience, losing a parent is a little bit different in the sense that there's the grief of the loss piece, which again, I didn't feel that as acutely with my biological father because I wasn't that close to him. So it wasn't like this daily presence in my life was gone. But there's also the recognition that you've lost one of the people that brought you into this world. Mm-hmm. There's reflections on your own mortality that come from that, the way you've lived your life. There's that piece, which is, I think, added on to or distinct from the feeling of loss, the grief of loss. And then I think, again, from my experience, there is value in reflecting on your own feelings and the way that you responded to it and thinking through what you might have done differently or what you learned. I think, one of the things that I learned that really surprised me when I realized it, but as I'm coming to understand myself better is, I had the grief of the loss, the feeling that, this thing that was super important to me was gone and was never coming back. And that I expected. The thing I didn't expect, and it really took me a while to figure out what I was feeling, was guilt. So I think thinking about like what are the things that are driving the emotions that you're feeling and what's underneath. And the guilt, I realized was really driven from the perception that I had failed Dobby. I had failed my wife. I had failed my kids by not keeping him healthy and alive, which is silly, right? But it didn't change the fact that I felt that.
Mm. Yeah.
And to some extent, it still doesn't, right?
Yeah.
I still feel that. I'm like, and this is probably my, maybe it's a personality defect that I, want to be the protector, and I wasn't able to do that. So I think understanding to the extent you can what's driving some of your emotions also can be helpful in the healing process.
Yeah, so since we're talking about guilt, it's like this is a cliche, which ended up being true, which is you keep thinking about, like, I wish I could see them one more time.
Yeah.
And by the time I saw him, I got the call, he was unconscious.
Yeah.
And, he wasn't coming back.
Yeah.
So I went back to mid-August around my birthday. He was at my party, and he wasn't fully himself. He was angry. He was, again, I'm sure he had some things going on. And I kind of knew this wasn't the dad I grew up loving. And then my wife kind of was like, I don't think he has all that much time left, just based on how frail he looked. And so when he left, I told him I loved him and all that, but I kept going back and like, man, I wish I would have hugged him. I wish I would have done this and that. And again, I know it's not completely rational. But that's one cliche that ended up being true, is that whole I wish I could see them one more time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think perfectly reasonable, perfectly normal, and hopefully helpful to recognize what you're feeling. You can't change it, but to recognize what you're feeling, why you're feeling it. And again, every situation is going to be different. I guess the one sort of universal is, when you go through a process like this, one of the takeaways that can be beneficial is for the important individuals in your life now, take the opportunity that you still have
Mm-hmm.
to build those relationships, share with them how important they are, make every day the best that you possibly can. I think that's one thing that a lot of people who go through a bereavement or a really profound loss can sometimes take out of it is a recognition that every day should be celebrated and savored.
Well, I want to add to that. So I was thinking about, I never met his dad, so my grandpa on his side. He left my dad, went to get cigarettes when he was 5 and never came back type thing. So my dad got 5 years with his dad. I got 33 years with my dad. How many years can I get with August? So my son, and my kids. So 60, I think. So again, I'm the black sheep. Even me being here talking to you, working at OptiSpan is obviously more of a health nut than they were. So that's one way I've been thinking about that too, is how he didn't have a framework for how to raise a kid. So I could look back and nitpick how he wasn't the greatest dad in all these certain ways, all this stuff, right? But instead, it's like he tried his best, and I'm gonna build off that and be even better for my kids.
Yeah, great. I think that's a fantastic approach. And recognize you're going to make mistakes. You're going to look back and be like, man, I wish I'd done that differently. But you can definitely take lessons learned and apply them, in your own life.
So the Cleveland Clinic talks about grief, and one thing I learned from it was I think of just family members or pets or living things, but they expanded it to you could grieve over your job, losing financial stability, losing your youth, which I think a lot of people can relate to a little bit, your home. So
yeah, and again, I think that's actually a really important point. Is we recognize grief when it's the loss of a loved one for what it is. Sometimes we don't recognize grief that we're feeling when it's something else, like you said, a loss of a job. And so maybe it's helpful to be able to view things through that lens and recognize that while it's maybe not identical, right? Losing a beloved companion animal or a parent or a spouse is not identical to losing your job. Some of the emotions, and I would argue some of the biological effects are shared. Mm-hmm. And recognizing that both the grief itself is common and hopefully some of the coping strategies, some of the ways to handle that grief in as positive a way as possible also could be shared.
Yeah. That's a lesson I've learned is what's traumatic to one person might not be traumatic to a different person. So I had a friend who's a firefighter, and he will do 10 CPRs a month. Heart rate stays around 70. If we were at the grocery store and someone needed CPR, we would be like full fight or flight adrenaline. So what might be dramatic to us is not to him. So
and going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, when it comes to a loss, again, the way that you react to a specific type of loss may be very different than the way I react to that type of loss, or even the way two people react to the same degree of loss could be very different. And it's really, I'm just going to say it again. I think it's really important not to be judgmental in that situation, to accept, that person also lost something that is extremely important to them. And just because they're not, crying or walking around in a funk, whatever their response is, just because it's not the same as yours, doesn't mean they aren't feeling it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Did you find yourself, there's the whole idea of the 5 stages of grief. Did you find yourself going through those or not quite?
I don't know. I mean, again, in this case, I don't, maybe, I don't really think I was in denial. I think I always knew, because it was dragged out so long. I mean, again, so I think I knew rationally, maybe the fact that I felt guilt, there was some denial there, because clearly the fact that I felt guilt, I was feeling that I should have been able to do something to prevent the situation. So maybe, and the same with anger. I don't really, maybe I had some anger. Bargaining, seeking impossible solutions, immortality for my dog, sure. Depression, absolutely. Overwhelming sadness and acceptance. Yes, I'm getting there.
Yeah, I would say my acceptance now. Definitely denial in terms of I still feel like sometimes I could text him. But it's like, no, that won't go through. So I don't know if that's just because it's so new.
Yeah.
Anger is different because it was more so anger at him.
Sure.
And because again, he didn't die from getting hit by a bus or from cancer. Sure. He drank himself to death essentially, and the whole idea of I could have had 20 more years with him. He could have known my kids. So that's where the anger came from. And of course, the depression, acceptance, I feel like I went through, but not so much bargaining. So I'm kind of curious. So we talk a lot about the pillars, so eat, sleep, move, connect.
Right.
I think it would be interesting for us to talk about how grief affected our pillars.
I agree. And I also think from a big picture perspective, as we're thinking about the way grief impacts health span and potentially longevity, I kind of put it in two buckets, and they're related for sure. But there is the impact that grief can have on our lifestyle habits and choices that we know affect both health and biological aging. And that's where I would put the pillars, right? The pillars of health as we think about them, or if you can have 12 pillars if you want to, whatever. Eat, move, sleep, connect, impact your health for sure. And I would argue also impact the biology of aging. And that's part of how they impact your health. And then there's maybe direct biological effects of grief on the hallmarks of aging, the biology of aging. And so that I think is an interesting area to explore and think about, are there strategies that people can use to minimize the negative impacts of grief on health and aging?
Did you experience, in terms of like starting with eat, like a sort of a loss of appetite or anything?
Yeah, I did not. Maybe the day of. So in our case, we did at home euthanasia, so I knew it was coming, which just sucked. I just sucked. It still sucks to think about it. But day of, yeah, I didn't want to eat. Afterwards, I would say if anything, it was more. And this is I think an aspect of depression where it was just like, I don't care. I'm going to eat what I want.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was more like definitely my likelihood to eat food that I wouldn't normally eat that I consider unhealthy increased in the couple of weeks following.
Okay, so kind of like your discipline to say no went down a little bit, or however you sort of
Yeah,
call
and
it,
I
your
mean some of
inhibition.
it may be like comfort food. And again, I don't
Yeah.
feel bad about it. Like
Yeah.
I think there is a time, there are times when food that brings you comfort can have value, even if it's not part of your normal diet and may not be the healthiest thing that you could eat. There are social occasions where you might eat stuff you would normally eat, but in that social environment, there's value to it because of the connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are times when that's the case. And so I think in my specific case, it was a limited amount of time. It wasn't like I was just, binge eating junk all the time, but there were certainly, probably a week afterwards, and certainly specific situations where I was like, you know what, we're just going to order out and I'm going to get super nachos.
Yeah, super nachos, yeah. What's kind of a quick aside is, the only time I saw my dad cry in 6 years was actually when our German Shepherd died back in 2012.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a crier. I never have been. I cried a lot.
Yeah.
A lot. And I still sometimes, feel like I'm going to tear up.
Yep. Yeah, and I know. So what about sleep? Did you notice any disturbance in your sleep?
Yeah, again, the night before, night after, for sure. I wouldn't say I think my sleep quality probably declined, but I didn't dwell on it. So it wasn't one of those things where I, woke up and couldn't go back to sleep and worried about it. There were a few nights where I woke up, I immediately started thinking about Dobby, and I just got up and did stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, my sleep quality probably declined, but it wasn't a major issue for me from that perspective. And I think it's all tied up in, we haven't talked about move yet, but if you're not exercising as much, your sleep quality may decline because you're not exercising as much. So these things are kind of tied together. What about you?
I just noticed latency. So usually, my Oura Ring tells me like 5 minutes, I'm out.
Yeah.
I would lay there for 30 minutes just thinking about him, or even like going and reading my last text. So that was the only, once I was asleep, I was good. But
yeah. And we kind of skipped over it. But what about you for eat? Were there any impacts there that you noticed?
So what I looked, so me personally, it was more loss of appetite. I ate a lot less, which is also kind of out of character for me. So it seems like there's sort of two routes. So people either comfort eat or they lose appetite, and I think we're an example of each one. So then that kind of brings us to move. So do you notice any difference in your sort of movement routine?
Definitely for, again, the first week or so afterwards, I just wasn't motivated. Like I just, again, it was, for me, and maybe, I think this is true for a lot of people, depression is sort of tied up in a more sort of apathetic approach where you're just like, I don't really care, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely had a decreased motivation to exercise. I pushed through it intentionally, and that helped. Like every time when I was like, I just don't want to do it, and I would go exercise, I felt better afterwards. Yeah. So I think that's one of the take homes is, to the extent that you are up for it, try to push through that feeling of apathy or lack of motivation. If you've got it, you almost certainly will feel better for doing the exercise.
Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah, I always split up move into two categories in my head. So one is like the deliberate exercise. I'm in the gym, I'm on the treadmill machine or lifting weights. The other one is just your walks and stuff throughout the day.
Yeah.
I would say that one I increased. I just wanted to go, I kind of maybe wanting to be alone, wanting to listen to music. I'd go for a lot of walks in the gym. And this is really out of character for me. Because again, I was a personal trainer for 8 years. I started working out when I was 12. I would just not care. I would just kind of I didn't want to lift weights. I didn't have that drive, that motivation. So it's back now, but that was really odd for me.
Yeah.
I worked out when I had COVID, the day my kids were born. So the grief and that sort of depression was the first time I got less enjoyment out of lifting.
Yeah. I think, it's not uncommon. And two thoughts, right? One is give yourself grace again. Don't beat yourself up about it. And, hopefully fairly soon after the grief experience, you push yourself to get back into it. And then I think most of the time you'll be glad that you did.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So this is probably the most obvious one. So the fourth one is just connect.
Yeah.
So, a big part of it is you're losing somebody directly affecting that pillar, someone you're connected to.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. A huge sense of loss in my case of a relationship that was important to me. And though I think, I was very fortunate that I have my wife who it was shared grief for sure, but I think we handled it by focusing on our ability to talk to each other about it. And I think that helped. So there was a strengthening of connect in some ways and a loss of a key relationship. So I think in this situation, those things balanced each other out.
Yeah, I completely agree. So one example is, for details I won't go into, my sister was mad at me before this. We hadn't talked in a while. We're great now. The day we met up at the hospital, we've been good ever since.
Yeah.
We've gotten dinner and all that. And my mom's getting into working out now. She wants to take care of her own health. Right. So me walking her through a workout routine was something I never thought would happen.
Right.
So
yeah. And again, I think those are really great examples of how, if you're able to step back a few weeks later, a few months later, and really try to look at the experience through the lens of positives, you might see some positives that you didn't anticipate, right? And again, this came out in our workshop, how our brains are tuned to see what we tell our brains to see. So if a month after the grief inducing situation happened, if you look back at it through the lens of, oh my God, that was so terrible, everything sucks, that's what you're going to see. Mm-hmm. If you look back at it through a lens of, what positives came out of this, that's what your brain's going to see. And I think of course it's going to be both, right? You lost something important and there probably were some good things that came out of it or could be good things. And I think shifting that framework, we move towards and become like that which we think about, right? Shifting that framework to the positive in every aspect of life, but particularly when you're going through a grief experience, can have a lot of benefits and lead to some unanticipated positives that you will recognize.
I completely agree. Like the closest thing I have to a superpower is turning obstacles into opportunities.
Yeah.
I have this image in my mind of like a blazing fire, and every fuel you add to it just makes the fire bigger. So good things, bad things, using that as fuel, which is and probably why I want to take this, learn from it. And now we're doing an episode, we're helping other people,
hopefully,
applying it to my work. So this is obviously more your domain. So I'm curious how the hallmarks of aging are affected by grief and loss.
Yeah, I don't think we know a lot about this. So I will say this is certainly an understudied area in the biology of aging. There's some literature on the impact of grief on biological aging. I think the first thing to say is, there's no question that grief has profound biological consequences, right? I mean, we think about grief as an emotional situation, but of course, emotion is biology, right? The way we feel about things is driven by brain chemistry largely. So grief has really profound biological impacts in our brain and throughout the rest of our body. That is true both fundamentally, meaning that the grief experience itself will change brain chemistry. It will change hormone secretion, hormone levels throughout the rest of the body. And then, as we talked about, it may change your behaviors in ways which will have downstream biological consequences. So how does that intersect with the biology of aging? And in general, I think we're going to look at this through the lens of what are the negative impacts of grief on biological aging. It's valid to ask the question, are there any positives? I don't know the answer to that. Certainly, I think we can point to some aspects of grief that have been associated with what we would consider negative outcomes on the biology of aging. So there is evidence that bereavement, loss of a spouse, loss of a loved one can impact telomere length, shortened telomeres. So that's one of the hallmarks of aging. There's evidence that grief leads to a higher inflammatory state. So, systemic chronic inflammation is a hallmark of aging. There's a little bit of evidence looking at epigenetic aging. So these epigenetic clocks, again, usually associated, I think, with loss of a spouse and showing that you see changes in the epigenetic clocks. Certainly a large body of literature on declines in cognitive function following significant grief, and particularly often this is looked at in the context of spousal loss. Often that's in older people. But it is the case that loss of a spouse is associated both with higher risk of mortality. I think it's something like 40 or 50% increase in mortality over, a period of the next 6 months to a year, if I remember correctly, but also declines in cognitive function, which might be cognitive aging. Again, it's a little bit harder to know. So yeah, there are multiple hallmarks of aging, some of them molecular, some of them functional, that seem to be negatively impacted by grief. I think one of the open questions is it a transient thing? Probably. I certainly would not anticipate that a grief experience early in life is going to lead to, a higher biological age or older biological age for the rest of your life, but it's hard to know. I think we just don't know enough at this point. So yeah, I think there's reason to believe that grief can impact biological aging. And again, the mechanisms there, telomere shortening, metabolic dysfunction, hormonal changes, increased stress hormones and stress levels in particular, all may tie into the effects that we see on health and at least some metrics of biological age.
Is immune dysfunction a hallmark of aging?
Right. So immune dysfunction, I would also put in the category of chronic inflammation. So immune dysfunction can mean lots of different things, but sort of at its, core, it means that your immune system is not working optimally. And chronic inflammation is a suboptimal functioning of the immune system. So yes.
So that was something I've noticed firsthand. So within a week after, probably the same week, I got acid reflux, which I never usually get. That was really annoying, eventually went away. And then I got a pretty bad cold, which again, my kids are in daycare. I kind of get colds around this time. And that cold eventually went away. And then I got a sty for the first time in my life. So I had one of the episodes you could see, I had a pretty bad sty in my eye, which now is also gone. And part of those three things, which I don't usually get, all happening within a month of my dad dying, made me think of the immune dysfunction.
Right. And again, I think increased levels of stress can also lead to impaired immune function, right? And again, so this is all kind of tied up, right? Yeah. In what is that biological aging? Is it sort of global health? Is it, system interactions between your different organs? I don't really know, but I think, yeah, definitely severe grief can lead to impaired function, broadly speaking, across many different tissues and organs, and probably accelerate some aspects of biological aging. I think one of the interesting questions is, as people get older, there's a decline in what we call resilience, right? Which is the ability to come back from a challenge, right? Where your biological system gets perturbed in some way, gets pushed out of its normal range. When we're young, our our bodies are pretty good at coming back to what we call homeostasis or normal function. As we get older, there's a loss of resilience and we become less able to do that. I speculate, and this is almost certainly true to some extent, that severe grief when we're older interacts with reduced resilience, which is why you probably see larger negative health consequences in older people who experience spousal bereavement or some other severe grief experience. It's harder for them to come back from that. They're going to be more likely to be negatively impacted from a health or mortality perspective.
Yeah.
Which also emphasizes it's even more important in older people experiencing grief to do some of these coping mechanisms, make sure that you maintain your healthy diet, maintain your activity level, prioritize your sleep, prioritize other relationships outside of the one you lost to give yourself the best opportunity to come back from that.
Yeah. So what are some of the takeaways for dealing with grief?
Yeah, I mean, again, so we've sort of talked about some of these. I'm just going to reemphasize, I think, the importance of avoiding judgment, right? And again, that's both judging other people and so like in my experience, when we lost Dobby, I felt profound grief. My wife felt profound grief. My youngest son, who came home for the euthanasia, felt profound grief. We all responded a little bit differently. And if we had judged each other for not all responding the same way, that would have made the situation, compounded the negatives, right? So I think avoiding judging other people is really important. And as much as you can, avoiding negatively judging yourself for how you're feeling. I think it's important to explore how and why you're feeling the way that you're feeling, but trying to do it without judging yourself or viewing yourself negatively. There is no right or wrong way to experience grief.
Yeah.
And it's going to be so dependent on your individual situation and where you're at. So that I think is really important. And related to that is acknowledging how you're feeling, right? Exploring and acknowledging how you're feeling. So I talked about how, I felt a lot of guilt associated with Dobby's passing, and I still do. It's not right or wrong. I know it's not completely logical, but understanding that I feel that, I think, is helpful. So acknowledging the way that you're feeling. And then we've talked about, to the best that you can, focusing on the pillars of health, taking steps to minimize, how impacted your pillars of health are by the grief process. I think exercise in particular is one, and maybe it's just my personal experience, but where I think, there are real opportunities to just kind of push through. You don't want to go work out, do it anyways. Or like you suggested, maybe, you're not going to do your resistance training today. Go for a hike. That's something that my wife and I did, the weekend after it happened, right? Get outside, go for a hike with somebody else maybe. So you're hitting the connect pillar, the move pillar. But I think you have the opportunity, at least for me with exercise, it's easier to kind of push through some of that, miasma of just not wanting to do anything. Again, connect pillar, I think a lot of times people, when they experience bereavement, go into this almost self-imposed isolation. And again, it's kind of related to not wanting to work out. You just don't want to be around other people, right? You're like, I can't deal with it. I think it's important not to allow that to go on for too long. Sure, you might need to take a day, 2 days, maybe even a week for some people, and just disengage and kind of get right with yourself. But connect is one of the core parts of Healthspan, and you really have to make sure you don't become isolated and allow your grief to isolate you.
I want to add to that real quick. So I probably was told or heard, let me know if there's anything I can do for you 100 times.
Yeah.
And I was here with our health coach, Will, and I kind of brought it up. And again, he's a great coach. And I kind of was kind of annoyed at it. And he was like, Nick, this just shows how many people in your life care about you.
Yeah.
And he kind of reframed it for me. And again, the amount of flowers that were sent to me, and it was touching.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's a really great point, and I think sometimes well-intended comments can be misinterpreted or misperceived, especially when you're in that grieving state, right? Might be something where you would view that as a message of support normally, but because you're in that grieving state, it's annoying, or it feels like, why did they ask me that, right? I mean, I think like when somebody loses a dog, like one of the worst things you can be is like, when are you going to get another dog? It's like, I don't want to hear that right now.
Yeah.
A little bit, not a lot, but also then being able to recognize, okay, that's not meant in a it's not meant to be harmful, even if it hurts, sort of way. So, I think, and also, as you said, when people say something like that, it is out of a genuine desire to want to help. They just don't know how to help, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that's a good insight. And then I would put, it seems obvious to say, and yet many people, when they experience grief, turn to alcohol or drugs, and I don't know of any evidence that that's helpful. I think most people would agree it's not, and actually can prolong the process and certainly negatively impact your health. And I will say, the night that we lost Dobby, I definitely wanted to drink.
Oh, yeah.
But I didn't.
Didn't? Okay.
And I'm glad I didn't. I get it. I get why people turn to alcohol to kind of numb the pain. But again, I don't think there's any evidence that that is really helpful in any way, and often can be very harmful.
So kind of changing a little bit. So I got a few questions for you. So again, relatively newer to kind of working in this field. So from my perspective, it seems like this field maybe has an unhealthy relationship with death. So my question for you is, are people in this field more prone to fearing death?
I mean, I think certainly some individuals are, right? So the field of longevity captures a lot of different constituencies, right? Among the scientists who work on the biology of aging, I don't think there is a particular enhanced fear of death that's driving people to want to study aging. At least historically, that hasn't been true. Maybe now that possible that's changing a bit, but I haven't seen that. Certainly among the lay audience, the longevity enthusiasts, especially the people who subscribe more to the sort of immortality, extreme longevity camp. Yeah, there's a lot of people there that are strongly motivated by a profound fear of death. And I'm not going to judge that as healthy or unhealthy. I don't personally feel that, so it's hard for me to completely relate with that perspective. But yes, there are people definitely who are interested in longevity because they desperately want to believe that we are going to cure aging, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe it's not only death, maybe it's also the frailty, the declines in health that go along with aging. I mean, there's reason to be concerned and I suppose fearful of those things. My perspective is that fear of things you can't control is generally not a productive approach to life. So I try to view things through the lens of what are opportunities, what are some positives, as opposed to viewing life through a lens of fear. And I think that's a healthier approach. But yes, there are definitely people who hope that we can cure aging.
So working in this field, though, you can kind of have two thoughts at the same time. You can accept the inevitability of life that's going to end, but also want to extend lifespan.
Yeah, those are not.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, first of all, those are not mutually exclusive, and I would say they're completely compatible, right? Again, it seems obvious to me that maintaining as high a level of health and functionality for as long as possible, for as many people as possible, is a worthwhile goal, even if I don't personally believe that we are close to curing aging or immortality.
Okay. I guess it's kind of alluding towards people like Brian Johnson with the whole "Don't Die" campaign, where like that's the main mission. And
yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's hard to know with Brian Johnson what's real and what's not, and whatever. Yeah. I don't know if "Don't Die" is actually something he believes or if it's just a marketing campaign.
True.
You know. I mean, like the logo for my lab at University of Washington was "Live long or die trying," right? So
Okay.
whatever,
Yeah.
Uh, but I do think if you actually sit down and get people to really flesh out, what their hopes and goals are, it's okay to have it as a hope and goal that you're never going to die, right?
Hmm.
I think most people would also want to go along with that, maintaining a high level of health and functionality. Um, Personally, I don't think there's any reason to believe that we are close to never dying. uh, and and we still want to maintain health and functionality for as long as we can.
I kind of wanted to end on a somewhat positive note. So I kind of want to talk about sort of purpose. And of course, we're just end of two is sort of our own purpose. And I think the way I think about it is if, perhaps if you're very religious, you might derive your purpose from that religion. And the whole thing is, in college, I sort of became agnostic, and then people would be like, "So, what's your purpose? Like, where do you get your purpose from?" And there's this Viktor Frankl. So he was a Holocaust survivor, and he has this quote, which is, "Each day, life asks you a question about its meaning, and your actions are the answer." And to me, that sentence kind of encapsulates my purpose for life, which is what I do: is spending time with my family. It's the career I chose, and go into. So, I kind of want to get your sort of opinion on purpose as a whole and how you derive purpose from life.
Yeah, I mean, I think my purpose, motivation, kind of in big picture, is around wanting to contribute something that will positively impact other people. And I know that that may sound sort of trite, but really that's what it boils down to. So, do I have people in my life who are more important to me? Absolutely. My wife, my kids, my mother, my loved ones. But I also am driven by the goal of having an impact, wanting to leave the world a better place than I entered it, right?
Hmm.
And so that motivates me. I certainly appreciate and recognize that other people have other motivations, and I'm not judgmental about that. But that's where I really feel like I get up every day wanting to come here, do what I do. Why are we doing the podcast? Hopefully, it's helping people, and hopefully can have a larger impact after I'm gone.
Yeah, yeah, well said. I like that. Um, I wanted this. I tried to go back and find it. So Sam Harris, he's a neuroscientist, and he has this quote about this analogy, rather, about having an ice cream cone. So the ice cream cone represents sort of life, and inevitably it'll be gone, right? So if you sit there and you're sad that it's going to melt, you don't actually enjoy it. So you're thinking about death all the time. It melts in your hand. You don't even get to enjoy it. So his whole analogy is
Yeah.
just enjoy the ice cream cone, accept that it'll eventually be gone. Because if you don't, it'll be gone anyway, and you won't have
Right.
enjoyed it.
Right. And again, this comes back to the whole, do you view life through the lens of fear, or do you view life through the lens of love? Right.
Mhm.
And again, love in this context doesn't mean, amorous love necessarily. It means the absence of fear, right? So choose love, not fear, I
Mhm.
think is the simple message. And you can choose how you view life.
Well, I think that's good. Sort of way to end it. Do you have any other closing thoughts you want to talk about?
No, I mean, again, I think, grief is something that we're all going to experience. And this has certainly been a profound period in my life. I wouldn't say that I want to experience it again. I know I'm going to. And I would say I've learned a lot
Mhm.
from it. And there are positives that go along with the grief experience.
Yeah, I agree. This was a very different episode for us as well. So if you made it this far, appreciate you watching and listening to our story.
Yeah, and hopefully this gives you something you can use in your own life. We're all going to experience grief. We all go through it. It's a shared human experience. And hopefully you get something valuable out of this.
Thanks, Matt.